The scream of the saw biting through timber was the last thing Frances heard before she hit the ground like a felled tree. Fletcher Fairbanks had been checking his trap lines in the foothills above Cheyenne, Wyoming, when he spotted the lumber camp in the valley below. It was late August, 1878, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the workers below. He normally avoided such places, preferring the solitude of the mountains to the company of men, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the unusual sight of a woman working among the men, her slight frame dwarfed by the massive log she was helping to haul. Or perhaps it was the way she stumbled, caught herself, then continued working with a determination that bordered on desperation. Fletcher was a big man, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, often tied back with a leather cord when he worked. Years of living in the mountains, hunting, trapping, and hauling his own timber had sculpted his body into pure muscle and sinew. His hands were calloused and strong, capable of snapping a branch as thick as a man's wrist. At 27, he'd lived alone in the high country for nearly 5 years, visiting Cheyenne only when he needed supplies or wanted to trade his furs. He watched the woman for another moment, his keen eyes noting the unsteady way she moved, the visible trembling in her arms as she helped guide another log onto the cutting platform. The other workers seemed oblivious to her distress, focused on their own tasks in the sweltering heat. Fletcher was about to continue on his way when the woman's legs simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed in a heap, her body crumpling like paper in a fire. The log she had been guiding rolled free, and Fletcher's heart lurched as he saw it heading straight for her prone form. Without thinking, he was already running, his powerful legs eating up the distance down the hillside. He reached the lumber camp in seconds, his boots thundering across the hard-packed earth. He dove forward, grabbing the woman and rolling with her, just as the log crashed past them, missing her head by mere inches. The other workers finally noticed, shouting and rushing over. Fletcher ignored them, his attention focused entirely on the unconscious woman in his arms. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. Her face was pale beneath a layer of sawdust and dirt, her lips cracked and dry. Dark circles shadowed her closed eyes, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. "Frances!" A portly man with a thick mustache pushed through the crowd. "What happened to Frances?" "She collapsed," Fletcher said curtly, his voice rough from disuse. He stood easily despite the woman's weight, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing at all. "How long has she been working?" The foreman looked uncomfortable. "Since dawn, like everyone else." "It is past noon now," Fletcher said, his voice dangerously quiet. "When did she last drink water? When did she last rest?" The foreman sputtered. "We all got to work to do. Nobody gets special treatment just because she is a woman. She wanted to work here, so she works like everyone else." Fletcher felt anger surge through him, hot and fierce. "She is worked to death, you fool. Look at her." He adjusted his hold on the unconscious woman, noting how light she felt, how her clothes hung loose on her frame. "How long has she been like this?" "That is not your concern, stranger," the foreman said, puffing up his chest. "Frances Armstrong works for me. Put her down and get off my land." "I am putting her nowhere except somewhere safe," Fletcher said flatly. "Where does she live?" A younger man, barely out of his teens, spoke up. "She has a cabin about a mile north of here, sir, near the creek, but she's been sleeping here most nights in the supply shed so she could start work earlier." Fletcher felt his jaw clench. The woman in his arms stirred slightly, letting out a soft moan of pain. "Someone get her things," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "Now see here," the foreman started, but Fletcher cut him off with a look that had sent grown men running in the past. "Get her things," he repeated slowly, "or I will come back, and we will have a much longer conversation about how you treat your workers." The younger man scurried off and returned moments later with a small canvas bag that looked pathetically light. Fletcher took it and turned without another word, striding away from the lumber camp with the unconscious woman in his arms. Her cabin was easy enough to find, but when Fletcher kicked open the door, his heart sank. The place was barely fit for animals, let alone a human being. The roof had holes, the single window was cracked, and there was no furniture except a rickety chair and a thin bedroll on the floor. The fireplace looked like it had not been used in weeks, and there was no food anywhere in sight. "Not taking you here," Fletcher muttered, adjusting his hold on the woman. Frances, they had called her. Frances Armstrong. He looked down at her face, noting the delicate bone structure beneath the grime and exhaustion. She was pretty, he realized with a start. Or she would be if she were not half-starved and worked nearly to death. He made a decision in that moment that would change both their lives forever. His own cabin was a good 5 miles into the mountains, a hard climb even for him. But it was solid, warm, and had everything needed to nurse someone back to health. He had built it himself 3 years ago, after his first 2 winters in a makeshift lean, to convince him that even a mountain man needed proper shelter. Fletcher set off at a steady pace, his powerful legs carrying him and his burden up the steep mountain trails with relative ease. Frances did not wake, which worried him more than he wanted to admit. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing still too shallow and rapid. He could feel heat radiating from her skin through her threadbare clothes. Fever, exhaustion, dehydration, probably malnutrition as well. The fool foreman had worked her into the ground and thought nothing of it. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks when Fletcher finally reached his cabin. It was set in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a clear stream running nearby. The cabin itself was sturdy, built from logs he had cut and hewn himself. It had a good stone fireplace, a proper roof, and real windows with shutters. Inside was sparse but comfortable, with a large bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves for supplies, and his furs and tools hanging from the walls. Fletcher kicked the door open and carried Frances straight to his bed, the only bed in the cabin. He laid her down gently on the thick bearskin blankets, then immediately set about building a fire and heating water. She needed liquids first, then food if she could keep it down, then rest. Lots of rest. As the water heated, Fletcher returned to the bed and began the task of removing Frances's boots. They were worn through in places, held together more by determination than leather. Her stockings had holes in them, and he could see blisters and raw spots on her feet. He shook his head grimly and continued his assessment. Her hands were in similar condition, covered in cuts, splinters, and calluses that spoke of hard labor without proper gloves or care. When the water was warm, Fletcher soaked a cloth and began gently cleaning the dirt and sawdust from Frances's face and hands. As the grime came away, he could see her features more clearly. She had a strong jaw and high cheekbones, with dark lashes that lay like crescents against her pale skin. Her hair, which he had thought was brown, was actually a deep auburn color where it was not caked with sawdust. It was roughly cut as though she had done it herself with a dull knife and hung just past her shoulders. Frances stirred again as the cool cloth touched her face, her eyelids fluttering. "No," she mumbled, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "Have to work, cannot stop, have to pay." "Shh," Fletcher said quietly, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "You are safe now. Rest." But Frances's eyes snapped open, wide and panicked. They were a startling shade of green, he noticed, like the new leaves in spring. "Who are you?" she gasped, trying to sit up. "Where am I?" Fletcher placed a large hand on her shoulder, keeping her down with minimal pressure. "Easy. You collapsed at the lumber camp. I brought you somewhere safe. You need to rest." "I cannot rest," Frances said desperately, still trying to rise despite her obvious weakness. "I have to work. I have to pay. They will take the land if I do not pay." "You will not be paying anything if you are dead," Fletcher said bluntly. "And you were about 10 minutes from dead when I found you. Now lie still and drink this." He held up a cup of water. Frances stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes trying to focus. He could see her taking in his appearance, from his long dark hair to his buckskin clothing, to the obvious muscle of his arms and chest. Most women would have been frightened, finding themselves alone in a remote cabin with a man like him. But Frances just looked at the water with an expression of pure longing. "Please," she whispered. Fletcher slipped an arm behind her shoulders and lifted her carefully, bringing the cup to her lips. "Slowly," he instructed. "Small sips or you will be sick." Frances obeyed, sipping the water as though it were the finest wine. Fletcher could see her throat working as she swallowed, could feel the tremors running through her body. When the cup was empty, he laid her back down. "More," Frances pleaded. "In a few minutes," Fletcher said. "Let that settle first." He dipped the cloth in the basin again and continued cleaning her face and hands. "What is this about land? What are you trying to pay for?" Frances closed her eyes, exhaustion clearly pulling at her. My father's claim. He died 6 months ago, mining accident. The land has a mortgage. The bank said I have to pay or they will foreclose. I've been working every job I could find, trying to make the payments. Fletcher felt anger stir in his chest again. How much do you owe? $200, Frances said, her voice breaking. I have saved $53 so far. The next payment is due in 3 weeks. I need another $30, or they will start foreclosure proceedings. A tear slipped from beneath her closed eyelid. I have been working at the lumber camp for a month. The foreman pays less than he promised, and he charges for meals in the shed. I thought I could do it. I thought I could save enough. By working yourself to death? Fletcher demanded. What choice do I have? Frances opened her eyes again, and Fletcher was struck by the fierce determination in them despite her obvious frailty. I have nothing else. No family, no money, nowhere else to go. That land is all I have left of my father. He spent 10 years working that claim. I cannot just let the bank take it. Fletcher was quiet for a moment, studying her face. He knew about loss and determination. He knew about fighting for something when everyone told you to give up. What is on the land? Does the claim produce anything? Frances shook her head weakly. Not gold, if that is what you mean. My father never found the motherlode he was looking for. But there is a cabin, better than most. There's a vegetable garden I planted. There is a good well. It is a place to live, to build something. I thought maybe I could take in laundry or sewing or find some other way to make money once the mortgage was paid off, I thought. She trailed off, more tears sliding down her temples into her hair. Stop crying, Fletcher said, though not unkindly. You are losing water you cannot spare. He offered her more to drink, and again she sipped slowly until the cup was empty. Now sleep. We will talk more later. I cannot sleep, Frances protested, but her eyes were already closing. Have to go back to work, have to pay. You're not going anywhere for at least 3 days, Fletcher informed her. Probably longer. Now sleep before I tie you to the bed. He thought he saw a hint of a smile touch Frances's lips before she finally surrendered to exhaustion. Within seconds, her breathing deepened and evened out into the rhythm of true sleep. Fletcher watched her for another moment, then rose and set about preparing food. She would need to eat when she woke, and he wanted to have something ready. As he worked, Fletcher found his thoughts returning again and again to the woman sleeping in his bed. She was brave, that much was clear. Foolishly brave, perhaps, working herself into the ground for a piece of land and a mortgage. But brave nonetheless, and determined, and alone, with no one to help her and no one to care if she lived or died. He knew that feeling all too well. Fletcher had come to the Wyoming Territory 5 years ago, running from a past he preferred not to think about. His family had disowned him after he refused to follow his father into banking, preferring the wilderness to civilization. He had taught himself to survive in the mountains, learning to hunt, trap, and live off the land. It was a hard life, but it was honest, and it was his own. He had not regretted his choice, not once in all those years. But he had been lonely. He could admit that now, watching Frances sleep. He had been lonely for longer than he cared to remember. Fletcher shook his head, pushing away such thoughts. The woman needed help, nothing more. He would nurse her back to health, help her figure out her situation with the land, and then send her on her way. That was all. He was a mountain man, a solitary creature. He had no business thinking about anything else, but even as he thought it, he knew he was lying to himself. Frances slept through the rest of that day and all through the night. Fletcher checked on her regularly, making sure her breathing stayed even and her fever did not spike. He slept fitfully in his chair by the fire, unused to having another person in his space. Every time Frances stirred or made a sound, he was instantly awake and alert. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when Frances finally woke again. Fletcher heard her moving and went to the bed where she was trying to sit up. Slowly, he cautioned, helping her into a sitting position. How do you feel? Like I was trampled by a herd of buffalo, Frances admitted. Her voice was stronger now, though still hoarse. Where am I? I remember collapsing and then. She looked around the cabin, taking in her surroundings properly for the first time. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the pelts hanging from the walls, the rifle over the door, the general air of masculine habitation. This is your home? It is, Fletcher confirmed. You are about 5 miles into the mountains from Cheyenne. I am Fletcher Fairbanks. I live up here, mostly alone. Trapping, hunting, some timber work. Francis Armstrong, she said, though he already knew. You carried me all the way up here? You needed proper care. Your cabin was not fit for it. Francis flushed, embarrassment coloring her pale cheeks. I know it is not much. I have been spending all my money on the mortgage payments. There has not been anything left for repairs or, she gestured vaguely at herself, other things. You need to eat, Fletcher said, changing the subject. He brought over a bowl of stew he had kept warm by the fire. It was simple fare, venison and wild vegetables, but it smelled delicious, and Francis's eyes went wide at the sight of it. I cannot take your food, she said, even as her stomach growled audibly. You can and you will, Fletcher said firmly. You are thin as a rail and weak as a kitten. Now eat before I have to feed you myself. Francis took the bowl with shaking hands and ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Fletcher watched her, noting the way she tried to restrain herself despite her obvious hunger, the way she made herself chew slowly and carefully. She had discipline, he would give her that. Most people half-starved would have gulped the food down and made themselves sick. When the bowl was empty, Francis set it aside and looked at Fletcher directly. Thank you, she said simply. For the food, for helping me, for bringing me here. I know I am probably a burden you did not ask for. No one should work themselves to death because they have no other choice, Fletcher said gruffly. You needed help. I helped. That's all. That's not all, though, is it? Francis said quietly. You saved my life yesterday. That log would have killed me if you had not pulled me away. The other men told me, when I was half-conscious. They said you came out of nowhere like an avenging angel and snatched me from certain death. Fletcher felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No, Francis said with certainty. They would not have. Most people in Cheyenne cross the street to avoid me now. They think I am cursed, or bad luck, or just too much trouble. My father had a reputation as a dreamer who could never quite strike it rich. People thought he was a fool. They think I am a fool too, for trying to keep his land. Are you a fool? Fletcher asked directly. Francis considered the question seriously. Maybe. Probably. But it is my choice to be foolish about this if I want to be. That land is all I have. It is the only thing in the world that is mine. I will not give it up without a fight, even if the fight kills me. It almost did kill you, Fletcher pointed out, and what good will the land do you if you are dead? At least I will have died trying, Francis said with a flash of spirit that Fletcher found himself admiring despite himself. At least I will have fought for something that mattered. That is more than most people can say. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Tell me about the land. Exactly how much you owe, when payments are due, what resources you have. Francis looked at him suspiciously. Why? Because maybe there is another way, Fletcher said, a way that does not involve you killing yourself at a lumber camp. But I need to know the full situation first. So Francis told him. The mortgage had been taken out by her father 3 years ago, when he was convinced he was close to finding a significant gold deposit. The bank had given him $200 at a steep interest rate. Her father had made sporadic payments when he could, but after his death in the mining accident, the bank had called in the full balance. They had given Francis 1 year to pay everything, including back interest. That year was almost up. The payments are $30 a month for the next 3 months, Francis explained. If I make all 3 payments, the debt is settled and the land is mine free and clear. But if I miss even 1 payment, they start foreclosure. I have been working every job I can find, but none of them pay enough. The lumber camp was the best option, even though the foreman is a cheat and the work is brutal. I thought I could do it. I thought I could last another 2 months and save enough. You would not have lasted another 2 weeks, Fletcher said bluntly. You were dying, Francis. Could you not see that? Of course I could see it, Francis said, her voice rising with emotion. But what else could I do? Tell me, Fletcher Fairbanks, what else could I do? Fletcher met her eyes, saw the desperation and fear and stubborn determination there. He made another decision that would change everything. You could accept help. You could let someone else share the burden for once. Francis shook her head. I have no one to help me. I told you, I have no family, no friends, nothing. You have me, Fletcher said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Frances stared at him, her green eyes wide with shock. What? You have me, Fletcher repeated. I will help you with the payments. I have money saved from my furs and timber. I will give you what you need to pay off the mortgage. No, Frances said immediately. Absolutely not. I cannot accept that. I barely know you. You do not owe me anything. I know I do not owe you anything, Fletcher said patiently. I'm offering because I want to. Because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because no one should have to fight alone when they do not have to. Because I have the means to help and you have the need. That is reason enough. But why? Frances demanded. You do not even know me. We met yesterday. Why would you give me money, a stranger? Fletcher considered how to answer that. The truth was, he was not entirely sure himself. Yes, he had money saved. Yes, he believed in helping those in need. But there was something more, something he could not quite name. Something about Frances's fierce determination, her refusal to give up even when everything was against her. Something about the way she had looked at him with those green eyes and thanked him simply, without false flattery or manipulation. Because I want to, he finally said. That is reason enough. Frances was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I will not accept it as a gift. If you want to help me, it has to be a loan. I will pay you back every cent with interest. I will work for you or find some way to earn it, but I will not be a charity case even for you. Fletcher felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile he had felt in longer than he could remember. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man, Frances shot back, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. Fine, Fletcher said. A loan then. You can pay me back however you see fit. But first, you're going to rest for at least 3 more days. You're going to eat regular meals and drink plenty of water and let your body recover. Agreed? 3 days? Frances protested. That is too long. I need to. 3 days, Fletcher said firmly. Minimum. You can barely sit up on your own right now, Frances. You are in no condition to do anything except rest. And if you argue with me, I will make it 4 days. Frances glared at him, but he could see her fighting a smile. You are very bossy for someone who lives alone in the mountains. And you are very argumentative for someone who nearly died yesterday, Fletcher countered. Now, are you going to agree to rest, or do I need to tie you to the bed like I threatened last night? You would not dare. Try me. They stared at each other for another moment. Then Frances's lips twitched into a reluctant smile. Fine. 3 days. But only because I truly cannot move very well right now, and I suppose it would be foolish to collapse again immediately after being rescued. Very foolish, Fletcher agreed. Now, do you need anything? More water? Food? Help with? He gestured vaguely, suddenly aware that there were certain needs that might be awkward to address. Frances blushed, understanding immediately. I can manage, but perhaps you could turn your back for a moment. Fletcher turned away, giving her privacy as she slowly and carefully got out of bed. He heard her moving around, heard the slight sounds of distress as her abused body protested. He wanted to help, but he knew she would refuse. Pride was something he understood well. When Frances said he could turn back, she was sitting on the edge of the bed again, looking exhausted from even that small effort. Fletcher helped her lie back down without comment, pulling the bearskin blankets up over her. Thank you, Frances said quietly, for everything. I still do not understand why you were doing this, but thank you. You are welcome, Fletcher said. And then, because he could not help himself, he added, Rest now. I will be here if you need anything. Frances's eyes were already closing. Why does that make me feel safe? She murmured, more to herself than to him. I should be frightened, alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere. But I am not. Why? Fletcher had no answer for that. He watched as she fell asleep again, her breathing evening out, her face relaxing into peaceful rest. And he wondered the same thing. Why did having her here feel so right? Why did the thought of sending her away once she was recovered make his chest feel tight and uncomfortable? He pushed the thoughts away and returned to his work. He had traps to check, wood to chop, winter preparations to make. Just because he had taken in a wounded woman did not mean the world stopped turning. But as Fletcher worked through that day and the days that followed, he found his thoughts returning again and again to Frances, to the way she smiled when she woke to find him preparing food, to the way she argued with him about resting, even as her body clearly needed it, to the way she watched him move around the cabin, her green eyes following his movements with an expression he could not quite read. Frances, for her part, was having similar thoughts. She had been so focused on survival for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be taken care of. Fletcher was gruff and blunt, but he was also surprisingly gentle. He helped her when she needed it without making her feel weak. He brought her food and water without being asked. He changed the dressings on her blistered hands and feet with a care that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. And he was handsome. Frances had not let herself think about men in months, too consumed with work and worry. But it was impossible not to notice Fletcher. He was huge, all muscle and strength, with those powerful shoulders and arms that could probably snap a man in half. His hair was long and dark, often falling forward into his eyes as he worked. His face was rugged, all strong angles and hard planes, with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. But his eyes, when he looked at her, were surprisingly gentle. They were a deep brown, like rich earth, and they watched her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in years. On the third day, Frances was finally able to stand and walk around the cabin without too much difficulty. Her body still ached, but the bone-deep exhaustion had faded. She felt almost human again, which was more than she had felt in months. Fletcher watched her carefully as she explored his cabin, examining the pelts and tools and supplies with obvious interest. "You are looking better," he observed. "I feel better," Frances admitted. "Much better. I did not realize how tired I was until I finally stopped moving." She ran her hand over a particularly fine beaver pelt. "These are beautiful. You did all this yourself?" "I did. Trapping is what I do, mostly. I sell the furs in Cheyenne a few times a year, stock up on supplies, then come back here." "It must be lonely," Frances said quietly. Fletcher shrugged. "I prefer it. Or I thought I did." He paused, then added, "It has been less lonely these past few days." Frances turned to look at him, something warm blooming in her chest at his words. "It has been less lonely for me, too. I did not realize how alone I had been until I was not anymore." They looked at each other across the cabin, and something passed between them, something unspoken but powerful. Fletcher felt his heart begin to beat faster. Frances felt her breath catch in her throat. "Frances," Fletcher began, taking a step toward her, but before he could say more, Frances held up a hand. "Wait, please, I need to say something first." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I know you said you would loan me the money for the mortgage payments, and I am grateful, more grateful than I can possibly express. But I need you to know that I will pay you back, every cent. I do not know how yet or how long it will take, but I will find a way. I will not let you sacrifice for me without giving something back." "You do not have to," Fletcher started, but Frances shook her head. "Yes, I do. I have to. Because if I do not, then I am just taking advantage of your kindness. And I could not live with myself if I did that. You saved my life, Fletcher. You have taken care of me these past 3 days when you had no obligation to do so. You have offered me help when no one else would. That means everything to me. But I have to maintain my self-respect. I have to know that I earned my way, that I did not just accept charity. Do you understand?" Fletcher did understand. He understood pride and the need to feel like you could stand on your own 2 feet. He understood the fear of being beholden to someone, of owing more than you could repay. "I understand," he said quietly. "So, what do you propose?" Frances had clearly been thinking about this. "You said you live up here alone. You said you do trapping and hunting and timber work. All of that must take a lot of time and effort. What if I helped you? What if I stayed here and worked with you until the debt is paid off? I could help with the traps, with preparing the furs, with the cabin work. I am strong, or I will be once I am fully recovered. I am a hard worker. I could earn my keep and pay off what I owe you at the same time." Fletcher felt his heart begin to pound even harder. The thought of Frances staying here, living in his cabin, working beside him every day. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. "That would take months," he said carefully. "Possibly longer. You would be stuck up here with me, far from town, far from other people. Are you sure that is what you want?" "I do not have anywhere else to go," Francis pointed out. "Once my land is saved, I will have a cabin to return to eventually. But until then, why not here? At least this way I would be earning my keep instead of being a burden, and I would be learning skills that could help me survive on my own in the future." It makes sense. It did make sense. It made perfect, logical sense. But Fletcher knew there was more to it than logic. There was the way his heart lifted at the thought of waking up every morning and seeing Francis's face. There was the way his cabin already felt more like a home with her in it. There was the dangerous, terrifying possibility that he was already falling for this stubborn, fierce, determined woman who had collapsed into his life 3 days ago. "All right," he heard himself say. "You can stay. You can work with me until you feel the debt is paid. But I have conditions." "What conditions?" Francis asked warily. "You do not work yourself into the ground again," Fletcher said firmly. "You rest when you need to rest. You eat regular meals. You take care of yourself, because if I see you pushing too hard, I will step in and make you stop. Agreed?" Francis smiled, and Fletcher felt his breath catch at the beauty of it. "Agreed. I promise to take better care of myself. With your help, apparently, since you seem determined to mother hen me." "Someone has to," Fletcher muttered. "You clearly do not have enough sense to do it yourself." Francis laughed, a real laugh, bright and clear. It was the first time Fletcher had heard her laugh, and he decided immediately that he wanted to hear it again, often. "Fair enough," she said. "So when do we start?" "Tomorrow," Fletcher said. "Today, you rest more. Tomorrow, I will start teaching you what you need to know." And so it began. Fletcher took Francis down the mountain the next day to pay her first mortgage payment at the bank in Cheyenne. The banker looked surprised to see Francis looking so much healthier, and even more surprised when she handed over the $30 in cash. "I trust this squares things for this month," Francis said coolly. The banker counted the money and made a notation in his ledger. "It does, Miss Armstrong. I will expect the same amount in exactly 30 days, and again 30 days after that. Do not be late." "I will not be late," Francis promised, and Fletcher heard the steel in her voice. They left the bank and Fletcher bought supplies, more than he usually did. Flour and sugar and coffee, dried beans and salt pork, and even a few luxury items like honey and real butter. Francis protested at the expense, but Fletcher waved her off. "If you are going to be working with me, you need proper food," he said. "Consider it part of your wages." They returned to the cabin laden with supplies, and Fletcher began teaching Francis the skills she would need. He showed her how to check the trap lines, how to set new traps, how to read animal signs and tracks. He taught her how to skin and prepare furs, how to stretch and dry them properly. It was hard, messy work, but Francis approached it with the same determination she had brought to the lumber camp, only this time with proper rest and food to sustain her. The days fell into a pattern. They would rise with the sun and share breakfast together. Then they would head out to check the traps, often spending hours in the mountains. Francis learned quickly, asking questions and listening intently to Fletcher's answers. Her hands, once soft and blistered, began to toughen and callous in new ways. Her body, once dangerously thin, began to fill out with regular meals and healthy work. And slowly, gradually, Fletcher and Francis began to truly know each other. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their pasts. Francis told Fletcher about her father, a dreamer who always believed the next claim would be the big one. About her mother, who had died when Francis was young, leaving her to be raised by a succession of her father's friends and neighbors. About the loneliness of growing up never quite belonging anywhere, always moving from camp to camp as her father chased his dreams. Fletcher told Francis about his own family, wealthy bankers in Boston who had expected him to follow in their footsteps. About his refusal and the bitter arguments that followed. About leaving everything behind and coming west to find something real, something honest, something that was truly his own. About the first hard winters when he nearly died from his own ignorance, and the grizzled old trapper who had found him and taught him enough to survive. "His name was Jacob," Fletcher said one afternoon as they worked on stretching some beaver pelts. "Jacob Stone. He died 2 years ago, froze to death in a late spring blizzard. By the time I found him, it was too late. I buried him up on the ridge where he liked to watch the sunrise. I think he would have liked that." Francis heard the grief in Fletcher's voice and reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. "I am sure he would have, and I am sure he would be proud of you, of what you have built here." Fletcher looked down at their joined hands, then up at Francis's face. She was smiling at him, and he felt something shift in his chest, something warm and powerful and a little bit frightening. "Francis," he said quietly. "Yes?" But Fletcher did not know what he wanted to say. There were too many things, too many feelings crowding his throat. So instead, he just squeezed her hand gently and said, "Thank you." Francis understood somehow that he was thanking her for more than just her sympathy about Jacob. She squeezed back and said, "You are welcome." The moment passed, but something changed between them that day. They became more comfortable with casual touches, a hand on the shoulder, a brush of fingers as they passed tools. Fletcher found himself hyper-aware of Francis's presence, of the way she moved, the sound of her voice, the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to her skin. Francis found herself watching Fletcher work, admiring the fluid strength of his movements, the competent way he handled every task, the gentleness in his rough hands. Weeks passed, summer faded into early autumn, and the aspens on the mountainside turned gold. Francis made her second mortgage payment without difficulty, Fletcher having handed her the money without hesitation. She kept careful track of what she owed him, writing it all down in a small notebook she had bought in town. Fletcher thought it was unnecessary, but he appreciated her diligence. They were becoming a team, working together with an ease that surprised them both. Fletcher had lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to have a partner, someone to share the work and the days. Francis had been so focused on mere survival that she had forgotten what it was like to feel safe, to feel like she had someone she could rely on. But there was more than just partnership growing between them. There was attraction, fierce and undeniable. There were moments when their eyes would meet and hold, and the air between them would crackle with tension. There were nights when Francis lay in Fletcher's bed, he having insisted she take it while he slept on the floor by the fire, and she would think about what it would be like if he were beside her. There were mornings when Fletcher would wake and see Francis's face soft with sleep, and he would have to clench his fists to keep from reaching out to touch her. They danced around each other, careful and cautious, neither willing to risk the fragile balance they had found. But the tension kept building, growing stronger with each passing day. It came to a head on a cold October morning when an early storm swept through the mountains. Fletcher and Francis had been out checking the traps when the snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier. They hurried back toward the cabin, but the storm intensified quickly, the wind howling and the snow becoming so thick they could barely see. "Stay close!" Fletcher shouted over the wind, reaching back to grab Francis's hand. She clutched it tightly, her other hand gripping his belt as they pushed forward through the blinding white. They made it back to the cabin half frozen, their clothes soaked and their skin numb. Fletcher immediately began building up the fire while Francis stripped off her wet coat with shaking hands. But when she tried to remove her shirt, her fingers were too cold to work the buttons. "Here," Fletcher said, crossing to her. "Let me help." He unbuttoned her shirt with practiced efficiency, his large fingers surprisingly deft. But as the fabric fell away, revealing the thin chemise beneath, Fletcher froze. He could see the curve of Francis's shoulders, the swell of her breasts beneath the damp fabric, the delicate line of her collarbone. She was so close and so beautiful, and he wanted her with an intensity that took his breath away. Francis felt the change in the air between them. She looked up and met Fletcher's eyes, saw the naked desire there, and felt an answering heat bloom in her own belly. "Fletcher," she whispered, "you are cold," he said roughly. "You need to get warm." "So do you," Francis pointed out. Fletcher's own shirt was soaked through, clinging to the muscles of his chest and arms. Without thinking, she reached up and began to unbutton it, her cold fingers fumbling but determined. Fletcher caught her hands, stilling them. "Francis, if we do this, if we go down this path—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I will not be able to think of you as just someone working off a debt. I will not be able to let you go when the time comes. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Francis met his eyes steadily. "I do. And I cannot promise you anything, Fletcher. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that right now, in this moment, I want you. I want to be close to you. Is that enough?" It should not have been enough. Fletcher knew that. He should have been cautious, should have thought about the consequences, should have protected his heart better. But when Francis looked at him like that, with those green eyes full of want and trust and something that might have been love, he could not find it in himself to care about should or ought or consequences. "It is enough," he said roughly, and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was everything Fletcher had imagined, and more. Frances tasted like snow and coffee and something sweet that was uniquely her. She pressed against him, her cold hands sliding up his back beneath his wet shirt, and he groaned at the contact. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, pouring all his longing and need into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frances smiled up at him. "We are still cold," she pointed out breathlessly. Fletcher laughed, surprising himself. "We are. We should remedy that." He stepped back and quickly stripped off his wet shirt, then helped Frances remove the rest of her wet clothes. They stood before each other, nearly naked, the firelight playing over their skin. Fletcher had known Frances was thin when he first found her, but he could see now how much she had recovered under his care. She had curves now, soft and womanly, and her skin glowed with health. She was beautiful, and she was looking at him with the same appreciation he was feeling for her. "You're like a statue," Frances said softly, reaching out to touch his chest. "All muscle and strength. I have never seen anyone built like you." "Mountain living," Fletcher said, his voice strained as her fingers traced the contours of his muscles. "It builds you up, or it kills you." "I am glad it built you up," Frances said, and pulled him down for another kiss. They moved to the bed, tangling together beneath the thick blankets, seeking warmth and comfort and something more. Fletcher was gentle despite his size and strength, constantly checking to make sure Frances was all right, that he was not hurting her. Frances was bolder than he expected, exploring his body with curious hands and eager kisses. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, the storm howling outside while the fire crackled merrily in the hearth. Fletcher held Frances close, feeling her heart beat against his chest, and knew with absolute certainty that he loved her. He had fallen in love with this stubborn, fierce, determined woman, and there was no going back. "Fletcher?" Frances said quietly, her breath warm against his skin. "Yes? I think I am falling in love with you." Fletcher felt his heart leap in his chest. "You think?" Frances propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling in a curtain around her face. "All right, I know. I know I am falling in love with you. I did not plan to, I did not expect to, but I am." Fletcher reached up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "Good. Because I am absolutely certain that I am in love with you. Have been for weeks probably. I just did not want to admit it." Frances smiled, bright and beautiful. "What are we going to do about it?" "I do not know," Fletcher admitted, "but we will figure it out, together." They kissed again, soft and sweet, and Frances settled back against his chest with a contented sigh. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, all was warm and safe and perfect. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them inside the cabin together. But neither Fletcher nor Frances minded. They used the time to learn each other in every way possible, talking for hours about everything and nothing, making love when the mood struck them, simply enjoying being together. It was like existing in a perfect bubble, cut off from the rest of the world and all its complications. But eventually, the storm passed and reality returned. Frances had one more mortgage payment to make, and then her land would be truly hers, free and clear. They went down to Cheyenne together, hand in hand, and Frances paid the final $30 with a sense of triumph that Fletcher could feel radiating from her. "It is done," she said as they left the bank. "The land is mine. My father's claim is saved." "What will you do now?" Fletcher asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Frances turned to look at him, her green eyes serious. "I need to see the land again. I need to make sure it is in good condition, that everything is secure. And then," she paused, taking a breath, "and then I need to decide what I want my life to look like." Fletcher felt his stomach clench with fear. "I understand." They rode out to Frances's land that afternoon. The cabin was indeed better than most, a solid structure with a good roof and tight walls. The garden was overgrown but salvageable. The well was deep and clean. It was a good piece of land, Fletcher could see that. A person could build a life here. But as he watched Frances walk around her property, touching the cabin walls and the garden fence, he could see something in her face. Sadness, perhaps, or maybe uncertainty. "It is a good place," Fletcher said quietly. "Your father chose well." "He did," Frances agreed. "It is everything I thought I wanted. A place of my own, independence, security." She turned to look at Fletcher, and there were tears in her eyes. "So why does it feel so empty?" Fletcher crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "Because you are not meant to be alone here," he said fiercely. "Because a place is just a place without someone to share it with." "Is that an offer?" Frances asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "It is more than an offer," Fletcher said. "It is a plea. Marry me, Frances. Come back to the mountains with me, or I will come here, I do not care which. Just do not leave me. I love you. I cannot go back to living alone now that I know what it is like to live with you." Frances pulled back to look up at him, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you too, Fletcher. I do not want to live alone anymore either. I want to build a life with you." They kissed there in the middle of Frances's property, sealing their promise to each other. When they finally broke apart, Fletcher wiped the tears from Frances's cheeks with his thumbs. "So what do we do with this place?" he asked practically. "Sell it?" Frances shook her head. "No, I do not want to sell it. My father worked too hard for it, but maybe." She looked thoughtful. "Maybe we could rent it to someone who needs it. Someone like I was, desperate and alone and needing a chance. We could charge just enough to cover the taxes and upkeep and give someone else the opportunity my father gave me." Fletcher felt his love for her deepen even further. "You have a generous heart, Frances Armstrong." "Soon to be Fletcher Fairbanks," Frances corrected with a smile. They were married 2 weeks later in Cheyenne, in a simple ceremony at the church with the pastor and 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. Frances wore a new dress, simple but pretty, that Fletcher had bought for her. Fletcher wore his best buckskins and had even trimmed his hair slightly, though Frances had begged him not to cut it too short. She loved his long hair, loved running her fingers through it. After the ceremony, they returned to the cabin in the mountains that was now truly their home. Winter was coming on fast, and there was much to do to prepare. But they worked side by side, Fletcher and Frances, partners in every sense of the word. As the snow began to fall in earnest, they sealed themselves into the cabin for the long winter ahead. But unlike previous winters, when Fletcher had faced the cold months alone, this year he had Frances. They spent the dark evenings by the fire, talking and laughing and making plans for the future. They made love in the big bed, now truly theirs to share. They read aloud to each other from the books Fletcher had accumulated over the years. They were content. Spring came eventually, as it always does, and with it came new challenges and new opportunities. They found a young couple to rent Frances's father's claim, a man and woman who were just starting out and needed a break. Frances wrote up a simple contract, charging them just enough to cover the property taxes and basic maintenance. The couple was grateful to the point of tears, and Frances felt satisfaction in knowing that her father's legacy was helping someone else the way it had helped her. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythm of mountain life. Fletcher continued his trapping and hunting, but now with Frances by his side. She became as skilled as he was, able to track and trap with the best. They expanded their operation, bringing in more income, saving for the future. 3 years after their marriage, Frances discovered she was pregnant. Fletcher was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, fussing over her constantly until she finally told him to stop, or she would brain him with a skillet. Their son was born in the early spring, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Jacob, after the old trapper who had saved Fletcher's life and taught him to survive. 2 years later, a daughter followed, a tiny thing with auburn hair and a temper to match. They named her Grace because Frances said that was what Fletcher had given her when he scooped her up from that lumber camp and refused to let her die. Grace, for the second chance they had both received, the opportunity to build something beautiful from the ruins of their former lives. The children grew, wild and free in the mountains, learning from their parents the skills they would need to survive and thrive. Jacob was quiet and thoughtful like his father, while Grace was fierce and determined like her mother. Fletcher taught them both to hunt and trap, to read the weather and the land. Frances taught them to read and write, to think critically, to always fight for what was right. When Jacob was 10 and Grace was 8, they hired a young man to help with the trapping operation. He was a hard worker, eager to learn, and he reminded Fletcher of himself at that age. The business continued to grow, and eventually, Fletcher and Frances were able to build a larger cabin with separate rooms for the children, and even a small schoolroom where Frances could teach not only her own children, but also the children from the surrounding area who wanted to learn. Fletcher's family in Boston heard through various channels that he had married and had children. His father sent a stiff letter offering reconciliation. Fletcher showed it to Frances, and together they decided to respond with polite distance. They were willing to have a relationship, but only on their terms. They would not apologize for the life they had built or the choices they had made. Eventually, Fletcher's mother came to visit, a trip that was awkward at first, but grew warmer as she saw how happy her son was and how well Frances and the children thrived. She returned to Boston with stories of her frontier grandchildren, and slowly, tentatively, the family relationships began to mend. Frances's father's land continued to help others. Over the years, several families rented it, saved money, and moved on to their own properties. Frances kept in touch with many of them, proud to know that her father's dream, though it had never made him rich, was still providing opportunities for others. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Fletcher surprised Frances with a trip to Denver. It was the first time either of them had left Wyoming in years, and it felt strange and exciting to be in a real city. They stayed in a hotel with running water and electric lights, marveling at how much the world had changed. But after a week, they were both eager to return to their mountains, to their children, to the life they had built together. "I would not trade this life for anything," Frances said on the train ride home, her head resting on Fletcher's shoulder. "Not even for comfort and luxury and ease?" Fletcher teased gently. "Not for anything," Frances confirmed. "This life, our life, it is everything I never knew I wanted. You saved me, Fletcher, not just that day at the lumber camp, but every day since. You taught me what it means to be truly alive." "You saved me too," Fletcher said quietly. "I was just existing before you, not really living. You brought joy and purpose and love into my life. I was a hollow man before you, Frances. You filled me up and made me whole." They kissed there on the train, not caring who saw, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The children grew into adults. Jacob became a trapper and guide like his father, eventually marrying a sweet girl from Cheyenne and building his own cabin further up in the mountains. Grace, true to her nature, became a teacher and advocate for women's rights, shocking and delighting her parents in equal measure with her fierce speeches and bold actions. She married a lawyer who shared her passion for justice, and together they worked to improve conditions for workers throughout Wyoming. Fletcher and Frances grew old together, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming gnarled with age and work. But they never stopped working, never stopped moving, never stopped loving each other with the same intensity they had felt that day when Fletcher pulled Frances from certain death and carried her home to safety. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the cabin that Fletcher had built with his own hands, Frances stood and raised a glass of whiskey and a toast. "To second chances," she said, her voice still strong despite her years. "To stubborn mountain men who do not know how to mind their own business. To love that finds you when you least expect it and changes everything. And to the man who saw me collapse and refused to let me die, who carried me home and made me rest, and who has been my home and my rest ever since. I love you, Fletcher Fairbanks. Here is to 50 more years." "I will be 104, Fletcher pointed out with a smile. But he stood and clinked his glass against hers. "But if it means 50 more years with you, I will take it. I love you, Frances Fairbanks, today, tomorrow, and forever." They drank and their family cheered, and the celebration continued late into the night. But eventually, when all the guests had gone and the cabin was quiet, Fletcher and Frances stood on the porch together, looking out at the mountains that had been their home for so many decades. "Do you remember that day?" Frances asked quietly. "The day you found me?" "Every detail," Fletcher confirmed. "I was checking my trap lines. I saw you working at the lumber camp. I saw you fall. I knew in that moment that my life was about to change forever." "Mine too," Frances said. I was so tired, Fletcher, so tired of fighting alone. And then you were there, this huge, terrifying, wonderful man, and you scooped me up like I weighed nothing and carried me away. I should have been frightened, but I was not. I knew somehow that I was safe, that you would take care of me. Always, Fletcher promised, the same promise he had made countless times over the years. I will always take care of you. And I will always take care of you, Frances responded, the vow she had made in return. They stood together in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars come out over the mountains. They lived 10 more years after that anniversary, 10 good years filled with love and laughter and the joy of watching their family continue to grow. Fletcher passed first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 96, his hand clasped in Frances's. She mourned him deeply, but without bitterness, grateful for every moment they had shared. Frances followed him 6 months later, unable and unwilling to live without the man who had been her other half for so many decades. She died in the same bed where Fletcher had carried her that first day, where they had made love countless times, where their children had been born. Jacob and Grace were with her at the end, holding her hands and telling her it was all right to let go, that Fletcher was waiting for her. "I know he is," Frances whispered with her last breath, a smile on her lips. "I can feel him. He's calling me home." They buried her next to Fletcher on the ridge where he had once buried his friend Jacob Stone, the place where the sunrise was most beautiful. The entire community turned out for the funeral, a testament to the lives they had lived and the impact they had made. Jacob and Grace stood together, their own families beside them, and spoke of parents who had loved fiercely and lived fully, who had built something beautiful from nothing and passed that legacy on to their children. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations. Jacob's son eventually took it over, then his son after that. The stories of Fletcher and Frances became family legend, told and retold until they took on an almost mythical quality. The mountain man who saved the dying woman, the woman who refused to give up, the love that grew between them, strong and true and lasting. But those who had known them, who had seen them together, knew that no story could capture the full truth of what Fletcher and Frances had shared. It was in the small moments, the daily choices to love and support and cherish each other. It was in the way Fletcher's eyes would light up when Frances entered a room, even after 50 years. It was in the way Frances's face would soften when she looked at Fletcher, even when he was being stubborn and impossible. It was in the life they built together, brick by brick, day by day, a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, and a love that refused to be diminished by time or hardship. In the end, that was their legacy. Not the money or the land or the business they built, though those were important. Their true legacy was the love they shared and the example they set for everyone who knew them. They proved that it is possible to find your other half, even in the most unlikely circumstances. They proved that love, real love, is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about showing up every day and choosing each other over and over again. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Fletcher and Frances were together still, hand in hand, heart to heart, walking through eternity as they had walked through life. Partners, lovers, best friends, two halves of a whole, finally and forever complete. Their story began the day a mountain man saw a woman collapse from working too hard, scooped her up despite her protests, carried her home through 5 miles of mountain trails, and made her rest whether she wanted to or not. It was a simple act of kindness that blossomed into something extraordinary. A love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, nurtured in the mountains, and lasting far beyond the span of their mortal years. And if you visit that ridge today, where 2 simple headstones mark the resting place of Fletcher and Frances Fairbanks, you might feel something in the air. Something warm and gentle, like an embrace. Something that whispers of love that never dies, of bonds that transcend death, of 2 souls who found each other when they needed it most and never let go. That is the power of true love. That is the legacy of the mountain man and the woman he saved. That is the story that deserves to be told and remembered, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of compassion and the deepest loves grow from the simplest of beginnings.